This week we are going to be working on another reading strategy called Making Connections. Many of you have been using this strategy already, but this week we're just going to get a little bit more specific with how to use it, especially while you're annotating. There are 3 different types of connections that we'll be discussing this week. The first one is the text to self connection. When you're making a text to self connection, you are thinking about how what you're reading relates to your own personal self. Some questions to ask while you're reading to help you make these connections are: what does this remind me of in my life? What is this similar to in my life? How is this different from my life? So, thinking about ways the text or what you're reading is reminding you or is the same or different as things in your own personal life. Other questions: has something like this ever happened to me? How does this relate to my life? What were my feelings when I was reading this? Were you sad, happy, angry, disappointed, etc.? Have I changed my thinking as a result of reading this? So if you're reading something and as you're reading your opinion starts to shift, jot that down as a text to self connection. And then lastly, what have I learned from reading this? Again, that is a text to self connection because it's focusing on you as the reader, what you have learned. Here are some other things to think about when making text to self connections. Think about the similarities to your life, to your family, to your friends, things that you have seen, maybe on TV or in the news, feelings that you've had, experiences that you've had, or places that you have been. The next type of connection is a text to text connection. These are typically the connections that students struggle with the most. A text to text connection is when you are making a connection from something you've read to something else that you may have read. So, some questions to think about. What does this remind me of in another book that I've read? Maybe you haven't read a book that's similar, so you can also ask yourself, how is this text similar to other things I've read? Maybe you read an article on Facebook or you read an article on a news magazine. Those things can also relate to some of the things that you'll be reading throughout this course. And then, have I read about something like this before? Maybe in high school or maybe in other classes, you've read about similar topics. That is when you make a text to text connection. Here are some things to think about when making text to text connections. Are there similarities in the author? So, is the piece you're reading similar or is the author the same as something you've read before? Think about the topic. Is the topic the same as something you've read before, or the theme or the message? Or is the information being shared similar to information that you've read from another source? The last type of connection that we will be working on is a text to world connection. Notice that each one of the connections are abbreviated T to S, T to T, or T to W. That is how you will abbreviate them when you're using them in your annotations. Some questions to think about for text to world connections. What does this remind me of in the real world? How is this text similar to things that happen in the real world? How did that part relate to the world around me? I think the things to think about here are really important and what will probably help you the most when you are doing these types of connections. So think about, are there similarities or differences in something that you've seen on TV? Maybe a show or maybe on the news. Things that you have heard in radio news, most people don't listen to that anymore, but potentially a podcast. What is something that they're discussing on a podcast that you're also reading about currently? Maybe a newspaper article or a historical event I think now we can definitely say some of the events of the past are happening again. So maybe you're reading something like that and you can think about something that happened in the past and make that connection. Maybe you can connect something you're reading to a current event, something that is currently happening, something you've studied before, real world happening. So something in your community, in your city, in your town, in your state, or in the country or across the world. Also, think about conversations you've had. Is something that you're reading relating to a conversation? So, why are making connections important? Three basic reading, or I'm sorry, excuse me, reasons. The first one, it keeps the reader from becoming bored while reading. A lot of you I know say that you lose interest when you're reading. Making connections will help you to stay interested and not become bored. The reason why is because it sets a purpose for reading and keeps you focused as you are reading. And then lastly, it forces you to become actively involved. So it forces you to work on becoming an active reader, which is something we're working on throughout this course. So, how do you annotate your connections? First, you are going to read the text. You will go through and label each type of connection. If you see something that relates to yourself, label it T-S. If you see something that relates to another text you've read, label it T-T. And if you see something that relates to the world, label it T-W. And then after you label, you are going to explain each connection. So you're going to jot down a little note that explains how it relates to yourself, or how it relates to another text, or how it relates to the world. Here's an example. Here is a short piece about social media. You can see in the margins, I labeled each type of connection that I was going to make, and then I provided an explanation. This is what I am looking for this week in your annotations. I'm looking specifically to see that you are making at least one connection for each type. Again, email me with questions or concerns.